what are we now doing as manufacturers in the United States and in Europe to respond to the Chinese challenge? Are we capable of responding? Are we competitive enough? That's what's keeping everyone up late at night these days, trying to solve this China puzzle. How do we compete? That's what's right front and center for policymakers and for the executives leading the automakers in the West.
My name is Meg Rithmire. I am the James Robeson Professor at Harvard Business School, where I focus on China's political economy. And on behalf of the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations, I am delighted today to be speaking with Jorge Guajardo, partner at Denton's Global Advisor Group and former ambassador to China from Mexico, as well as Michael Dunne, CEO of Dunne Insights, a specialist on electric vehicles and automobiles, all things for a long, long time, on economic and trade relations between the U.S., China, and Mexico, and how they relate to the global vehicle market. So over the last 10 years or so, we've seen Chinese foreign direct investment in Mexico skyrocket. It used to be comfortably under 100 million per year in terms of flows before 2016, and now is up to nearly 570 million in 2022. Yet it remains really single digits in terms of a percentage of Mexico's overall FDI coming into the country. So while we have a lot of focus in popular conversation as well as policy on how we think about China's investment in Mexico and relationships with the United States as it relates to China's transition in many different ways, I thought I'd start out by asking each of you, Jorge, maybe you can start, to talk a little bit about the context. So the context of competition between the US and China over this new market in electric vehicles and how it's affecting Mexico. Thanks.
First of all, thank you. And thank you, Meg and Michael. Nice to see you again. So the big difference between Mexico and the US and now Canada as pertains to Chinese EV vehicles is that, one, you can find them in Mexico. You can buy them in Mexico. I was just in Monterrey, that's my hometown, a couple months ago, and I took my son to see the dealership of BYD. He was so enthralled with the cars that he asked if we could buy one and bring one to Washington, D.C., which is where we live. And the idea that somebody living in the United States would go to Mexico to find something they could not find in the United States is just so strange to me. I never imagined it would happen. That is the case now. We have EVs. Nevertheless, as Michael knows and we've discussed before, most of the Chinese vehicles exported to Mexico, which has become the second exporting destination for Chinese vehicles, are internal combustion engine. In fact, 95% of them are, and more than 50% are General Motors, a little more are Ford. So even though there's a big story about Chinese cars in Mexico, I would say it's mostly internal combustion engine cars and mostly US branded cars that are simply manufactured in China because they have huge overcapacity that they're now directing to foreign markets, Mexico among them.
Michael, how does it look from you, just in terms of the overall context and how we should be thinking about vehicles, China, Mexico, and the United States?
Let's take it from the Chinese perspective. There is massive overcapacity. China has enough capacity to supply half the world's demand for vehicles on an annual basis. We've never seen anything like this. At home, there's price wars. No one's making much money, and everyone's in a hurry to find global markets as a release valve and profits. Maybe we can make money overseas. So this has resulted into a massive push into new markets, including Australia, Thailand, Brazil, Spain, the UK, and Mexico. So much so that today, China is the #1 supplier of vehicles to the Mexican market. Imagine that. Just a few years ago, what? China built cars in Mexico? Yes, they're right on our doorstep. And as Jorge said a moment ago, here in the United States, or you travel up to Canada, you don't see any Chinese cars. So it's easy for us sitting in America to think, what's the big deal? But make no mistake about it, China's on an export binge. They're the #1 exporter of vehicles globally, and they're only getting started right now.
I'd like to think a little bit. There's been a lot of alarmism, right, about whether or not the U.S. tariffs at this point on electric vehicles, on Chinese vehicles will work, how it will affect or advantage the U.S. auto sector. And a lot of people are looking at what is now, a flood of exports, as you're both describing, into the Mexican market, as well as a flood of FDI, right, to export ideally, to outside of Mexico, as well as for Mexican consumers inside the Mexico market, as Jorge was explaining. But a lot of that on trade diversion, trade distortion, or Chinese firms trying to evade, right, U.S. rules about getting their vehicles into the United States, in particular, this particular market. And so I'd love to know what you both think about how that might evolve. So are tariffs going to work? Is the United States going to be able to compete in these sectors? And how does Mexico fit in with that? Michael, maybe we'll start with you.
Exports, in terms of tariffs, the United States has put in place, and more recently, just last week, Canada joined, is half the equation. Yes, we definitely need time to regroup, reset, and meet this new challenge coming out of China. So yes, let's have tariffs in place. Without them, as Elon Musk has said, Chinese automakers will more or less demolish every other automaker in the world. So yes, part A, complete, check. The worry is, what are we now doing as manufacturers in the United States and in Europe to respond to the Chinese challenge? Are we capable of responding? Are we competitive enough? That's what's keeping everyone up late at night these days, trying to solve this China puzzle. How do we compete? That's what's right front and center for policymakers and for the executives leading the automakers in the West.
With regards to tariffs, Meg, I think it's crazy that Mexico has not imposed steeper tariffs on Chinese imports. I mean, the auto industry is one of Mexico's biggest, if not the biggest employer. Mexico is the third largest exporter of cars in the world. It's one of our major industries. And to just leave the market open, again, especially to internal combustion engine cars, I find it crazy. Nevertheless, here we are. Ideally, I think we would bear the same tariffs that the U.S. and Canada has in Mexico to just act as a trading bloc. Having said that, I do not think that Chinese cars are entering the United States through Mexico. It simply doesn't work. And again, we're talking about EVs here. That's what mostly concerns, I think, U.S. manufacturers. You cannot buy a BYD in Mexico, bring it to the U.S., register it. Where do you service it? Does it? So, I mean, it sounds easy. In practice, it's really not as easy. So I don't think China is using Mexico to send cars to the United States. Nevertheless, it is sending a lot of cars to Mexico. I think it's crazy that Mexico would not increase tariffs, hopefully soon.
Why do you think Mexico doesn't have those tariffs in place as a member of USMCA? And do you see them coming just around the corner now?
So bottom line, the reason I think Mexico does not have these tariffs in place is because unlike the US, the European Union, and Canada, you'd be surprised that most developing countries don't have the human resources within their governments to monitor these type of issues. In the US, you have think tanks, you have academia, you have a huge bureaucracy that's just looking at this issue. You don't have that in Mexico. You don't have people following Chinese industrial policy, overcapacity trends. And all of a sudden, so it goes, I believe it was in 2021 that they had 3% of the Mexican market. In 2024, it's 20%. They come at you fast, and they come at you not only in cars, but in most every single manufactured good, construction goods, petrochemicals, cement, glass, synthetic textiles. Cars are just one of them, and maybe there hasn't been as strong a lobby within Mexico to block them. In the meantime, they start growing and they start creating a user base that now is a constituency for continuing because they want their cars being serviced by the dealerships, etc. So before you know it, they grow and they create an interest group that becomes their lobbyist. So that's where we are in Mexico.
That's fascinating in the sense that you would imagine that the opposition would grow, but it grows at the same time the constituency for the people who want the products grow. And so that politics, right, is hard to produce policy from. Although I want to, Michael, your question is perfect on the U.S. Canada-Mexico trade agreement, right? Because we need to think about how that's going to affect all this. And so the hysteria or concerns, I should say concerns. It's not necessarily always hysterical
Hysteria
on the
more
US part,
appropriate.
right? About, is China going to evade, right? The word is always evade, which, I have a bunch of questions about who's investing in Mexico and how much of this is just, market logic. And, because the US side, in a lot of ways, people are a little bit hyperbolic about the organization of the Chinese government and its firms to evade the tariffs, where in fact, it's, in my view, it's a lot of just commercial firms making commercial decisions about where to source production and where to access, right, their markets. But in that sense, how does the U.S.-Canada-Mexico trade agreement affect the landscape of the auto sector as we're seeing it shift in the direction of both EVs and globalized production coming from China?
Well, I think the auto sector is one of the most dynamic sectors of the USMCA. All three countries are producers of automobiles. I think it's one of the industries in which the USMCA just works perfectly, seamlessly. Nevertheless, the USMCA does have certain rules that if manufacturers comply with, supposedly they benefit from the USMCA trade agreements. Now, can China meet the rules? As things stand right now, unlikely. There is just no supply for China to meet the rules of origin. That's as the USMCA stands today. Now, there are things, for instance, the USMCA has certain rules of origin, even for engine parts of cars. Certain percent of the engine parts have to be manufactured within the North American Free Trade Zone. Now, electric cars obviously don't have engines. How does that qualify for the USMCA? There are still things to be figured out. I think it's more of a hysteria because, again, remember, there are no Chinese manufacturing cars in Mexico as of today. And even if they wanted to start tomorrow, it's unlikely that they could meet the rules of origin to qualify. But it's also a political issue, and we cannot assume that this is all in a vacuum, independent of politics. The fact is, everything in trade is tainted with politics. So I would also think it would be naive on the Mexican side to think that if they comply with USMCA rules of origin, that's enough to qualify. Most likely that won't be the case.
Michael, I'm sure you know the USMCA rules of origin, stipulations by heart. And so enlighten us, please.
They look airtight. In other words, there's no easy backdoor play or workaround for the Chinese. Now, having said that, just several weeks ago, I was in Mexico City and attended a launch event by BYD. They were showing their brand new pickup truck, which is a beautiful vehicle called the Shark. It's designed to compete head on with the Ford Ranger, the Toyota Tacoma, two best-selling vehicles here in North America. There were more than 1,000 people there, media from all over Central and South America in attendance, a first-class show. And I thought, wow, BYD and other Chinese, they're genuinely very serious about this market in Mexico. They're determined, hell-bent on carving out share here. And so if we play out the scenarios, you'd see likely, I think, Mexico will put in tariffs like Canada has done. Then immediately the Chinese would say, oh, we still want to access the market, so we have no choice. We'll put transplants in. We'll put assembly plants in Mexico just to serve the Mexican market because that's giving us market access. But, oh, by the way, maybe over time, we source a battery from CATL or BYD nearby, and suddenly we're getting very close to those requirements that will allow us to manufacture or assemble in Mexico and ship up into the United States and Canada. That's the scenario I'm sensing among Chinese automakers as we speak today.
And what's the time frame for something like that, right? So we see, I've been in Taiwan and Vietnam in the last few years, or the last year really, and watching these supply chains shift. And they'll all tell me, look, it's about a 2 or 3 year time frame for, it depends on what industry it is, right? But saying, yeah, you see these huge, flows of FDI, and then the exports will follow. So, that scenario you just outlined, how long might it take for such a scenario to obtain?
Well, we're all familiar now with the term China's speed, right? So what I'm hearing is Tesla, about 18 months ago, told its suppliers in China, if you want to continue to have business here with us in China, get set up in Mexico. Now, subsequent to that, Tesla's cooled on its own manufacturing plans for Mexico, but I can easily see BYD or other Chinese automakers telling their suppliers, get over to Mexico, and those suppliers move very quickly to set up plants. So What time frame? Within the next 2 to 3 years. You know, a lot of them are talking about let's wait until the election, see what happens on the other side of the election, dust settles, then we make our next move.
Along those lines, I'm really skeptical about this idea that Chinese car manufacturers are going to set up shop in Mexico. And I know BYD has been making a lot of noise about announcing an investment in the last part of the year, which we're already in the last part of the year. And Stella Lee, who's their representative for the Americas, keeps saying like, well, we're in the final phase of selecting a state where we will invest. It just doesn't add up to me. So they're talking about a $600 million investment for a facility that would employ 10,000 people. Now, if you look at Tesla's announced investment in Monterrey, which, as Michael says, they have since cooled down, they were talking about a $3.5 billion investment for a facility that would employ just about the same number of people as BYD is announcing. Now, a $600 million investment sounds either one as a CKD facility,
yes,
or two, maybe a battery, because again, if you're talking about entering the free trade zone of the USMCA, 50% of the value of a car is the battery. Right now, there are no batteries available for them to use and meet these criteria for rules of origin. So you can just, and second, the fact that they would be just targeting the Mexican market, that makes no sense. Mexico has no infrastructure for EVs. You don't have a market there the way you would have in other countries. So the idea that they would manufacture in Mexico for the Mexican market, I mean, they could. I just don't see the logic behind that, especially with the overcapacity they have in China, which they are increasing. They're buying ships more than investing in factories. Right now, they can already access the market as they are. So I am skeptical about that idea that they will soon be announcing a huge investment in Mexico, but I don't know. We'll soon find out.
The formula you just put forth, maybe it's a battery factory. Maybe initially it's just final assembly plus a battery factory. And then gets very interesting in a hurry in terms of their ability to make that as a base for export up into the United States and Canada.
But even if it were just a battery factory, you would, again, the components of the battery, the lithium, the cathodes, you can find them in Mexico. Again, so how do you meet rules of origin? Never mind whether the U.S. would then regulate and say that Chinese cars are seen as intelligence vehicles that would be handled by another ground. So, and I would add to that, I don't think the Mexican government is very keen at this point to see them set up shop in Mexico for the same reasons that we know we're coming up to the USMCA review process and we don't want this baggage. So even to just set up shop, you do need the help of the federal government on visas for your workers, on just setting a fiscal land use. If the federal government is not incentivized to welcome you, I don't see how they go about it. And I don't see how the Chinese government, which they also have a say, gives a green light if they think they could end up having pie in their face because they end up being blocked, or it's something that makes the Chinese lose face.
What would it take, Michael, for your scenario to obtain in that way in terms of, I mean, I was going to ask this set of questions about, U.S. policy responses, because if we do see, an actual effective shift of production to Mexico in such a way that they could meet the complicated rules of origin, then it's not as if there's no policy response possible from the U.S. government, right? And so, but what would it take, right? So, Jorge is really skeptical that it could happen. What would it take to make that happen? I mean, in terms of the supply chain for batteries, all of that.
He's right. The supply chains just simply are not there today for batteries. North America, open up the cupboard, you're looking, there's empty. Where are our supply chains? So there are seeds being planted in Brazil and in Chile, and you can kind of see a scenario where China's strategy is to enter from the south. That makes a lot of sense. But in DC, of course, we have, as Jorge mentioned just a moment ago, we have that extra ace in the hole, and currently that's software. So you've met all the requirements in terms of manufacturing and content. By the way, we don't like your software. if your cars come across the border with the software, they're not welcome.
Can I ask a question about that software? Because, the Biden administration has announced this review into electric vehicles and for national security concerns, right? The idea that it's collecting data on Americans and that data could possibly be used. I mean, my joke about that is always, what does someone's commute in suburban Atlanta, where I'm from, matter in terms of national security? So I would love an expert opinion on whether those, that national security concern seems valid to you and in what ways.
First of all, I don't think it's based on anything other than hunches, but hunches mean a lot in this political atmosphere. So we saw it, they did it with the cranes in ports, but not
the
with
ABB
drones.
concerns. Yeah, I know very well, right?
But not in drones.
Right.
I would imagine that drones would be more of a platform if you were into the spying. Now it turns out apparently the drones are airtight, or so they claim, that they cannot send information. Cars obviously are two-way platforms, communication platforms, so conceivably that would be easier. Now, if China is allowing Tesla to operate within China, I would assume there's a way to make sure that it's airtight, but I don't think there's a willingness to find a way in the United States, and that's all you need to worry about. If there is nobody interested, why even worry if it's true or not? It just won't happen. That's how I see it from Washington.
Yeah, well, as you know, you can drive a Tesla in China, but you can't drive it into the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So there are certain places where Western technology and software are off limits. But Michael, is it a legitimate security concern in your view, or is it again maybe a hunch but a good one?
Not so much with regards to privacy, individual privacy, as you mentioned, your commute around Atlanta, but definitely there's the wherewithal, the capacity to cause havoc instantly, remotely with through software access. So
that's less surveillance and more choke point kind of.
That's right. That's right. And it wouldn't take much, cause a series of accidents in major cities instantly. Do you remember several months ago where the ship, was it in Baltimore, outside Baltimore? I'm still not sure exactly the cause. What happened there? Why did that happen? So that was just a ship. That was a ship hitting a bridge. Imagine having major intersections in New York, LA, Chicago, at the same Atlanta. Whoa, what is going on? It caused mass panic, and no one knows what's the limits to what they can do. So it is real, and it is serious. And as you said, the Chinese do limit where Tesla can travel these days.
Right.
For the same reason.
Just to put this out there, and do we know they can't do that with Tesla? I mean, it's not as if they can just hack Chinese-made cars. They have, Bolt Typhoon has shown that they do have the cyber capabilities to infiltrate foreign hardware. So if they could do that with Chinese cars, presumably they can do it with U.S. cars just as well.
Absolutely. And it comes back to maybe it really, the story is protection. We just don't want your cars in our country.
Fair enough. Fair enough.
Okay, and here's our reason. And try to beat this one. Yeah.
In terms of protection, and I agree with that, I tend to be very protectionist when it comes to Chinese exporting their overcapacity. But here's the one thing that I keep coming back to. I do not recall a case of the U.S. public, the U.S. consumer, not having access to the best product out there, save for Iranian caviar and Cuban cigars. Those are the two items I can think of that the U.S. consumer does not have access to readily, that they are better. We're starting to enter a new era in which U.S. consumers may travel and find better things abroad that they can find in the United States. And that's a new world out there worth keeping an eye on.
Well, and Michael set us up nicely, I think, at the very beginning of the discussion. And he said that tariffs are only half of the equation, is what I heard him say. And so when we think about both, how important the auto sector is to both Mexico and the United States. I mean, huge employment, huge political power, right? Huge, national identity issues. And so aside from tariffs, even if Mexico, doesn't, decide to protect its market in that way, what would it take for both countries to actually make competitive alternatives to Chinese electric vehicles, given how quickly companies like BYD have presented low-cost, really user-friendly products to the rest of the world? So what's it going to take, right, to make a North American or an American alternative, right, thinking hemispherically rather than just nationally? How do we do this? What do we need?
Michael?
I was hoping, right, you're going to say, and we're running out of time, so
No.
we're gonna have to...
No, you have to solve all the policy issues before we hit end. So what do we need?
So here's the take. Keep in mind, today, United States and Mexico, we're super underdogs vis-a-vis China when it comes to electrics. Think of China as 10x whatever our capabilities are, from capacity to supply chains to battery technology. We're way behind. So what to do about that? One way is to say it's a long road to get to competitiveness. It'll take 10 years. It took China 10 years. In the meantime, let's develop those PHEVs and be happy with the hybrids and eventually, slowly, gradually get to competitiveness. But it's not the kind of thing that we can get there overnight. We just can't. Supply chain just takes years. So be patient, be determined, set those goals in place, and adhere to those goals. Don't waver from those goals, and understand we're way behind. It's going to take 10 years to catch up. That's a national priority. Let's make it a national priority. But don't think in terms of, oh, in a couple of years we'll catch up, we'll be fine. No.
And just to push you, do you trust the big three in the US?
I'm from Detroit. Come on.
No, but I mean, of course, we trust them to make good cars and sell them to Americans, but internal combustion engines, right? So you trust them to make that shift and to put the resources, or is it going to take a mix of public policy that's quite aggressive to get them to do that?
I would say it would be we're giving you these tariffs for this time frame. You must meet these benchmarks. If you don't, the tariffs go away, Detroit.
And just to compare, that's kind of what the Europeans hope to do, right? Is to do it, to bring in some Chinese production and then to do it kind of a temporal sunset of the tariffs in hopes that the German manufacturers rise up to that level. Is that basically right?
There's
a difference between the Europeans, the way Europeans are tackling this, and the US. The Europeans know they have to be in China. So the German auto manufacturers, even though they're losing market share, even though everything indicates that they should cut their losses and run away, they keep doubling down for the simple reason that they know they need to have line of sight of what's happening in China in order to develop better products for their domestic markets and the world. The US is on the retreat in China. Stellantis has all but left. Ford is cutting down. GM is cutting down. So it's a different approach. I'm not saying one is better than the other, but it's a completely different approach how the Germans are doubling down on China, whereas the US is retreating.
Yeah. Meg, one other thought just quickly is, our minds always go to the Detroit 3, but oh, by the way, we happen to also be the United States home to the very best EV manufacturer in the world by far. And ask the Chinese, they'd agree. Tesla is still the leader globally. Why aren't we throwing more weight behind Tesla and the Tesla model and encouraging other startups like Rivian, West Coast companies? That's where the innovation is going to come from. That's where the creativity and the risk-taking culture is. Hard for Detroit to get out from under 100 years of building gasoline-powered SUVs and trucks and going, oh yeah, we're going to shift to electrics where we make no money.
Yeah, a tiny kind of electric car is not really what Detroit does well yet, but don't count them out. But yeah, a different model of innovation, a bit more diverse of a field. And exactly, and Jorge, I love your thoughts about the Europeans. I just finished some survey work with American businesses, and what they're saying is half of them are saying the things I've heard from both of you two in the last half hour, which is, many of our competitors are in China. We need to be in China so we know what our competitors are doing. We don't want to be blindsided in Thailand or in Brazil by, our Chinese competitors. But they're also saying their number one concern is network security, right? That they're worried about China as a source of network insecurity, hacking, things like that, rather than just competition or other things. And so it's a mix of some of these things. We've got to close out. Just a last quick question. So obviously the U.S.-Mexico relationship is long, it is strong, it is not uncomplicated. And now we have, in many ways, whether it's in the auto sector or in the many other sectors in which Chinese companies are investing in Mexico, China as a new entrant, a new third party into that relationship. And so I'd like to hear both of your views on how that relationship between the U.S. and Mexico may or may not change in the context of increasing Chinese economic engagement there.
If I may take a first crack, Meg, China in Mexico is a U.S. narrative. It's not really happening in Mexico. China is not even in the 10 top foreign direct investment countries in Mexico. You can't read the U.S. news without reading about the Hofusan Industrial Park in Mexico for Chinese manufacturers. That happens to be in Monterrey. That's my home city. I was in Monterrey meeting with owners of industrial parks. I was asking them about the Hofusan Industrial Park, this behemoth that apparently is the beachhead for all these Chinese manufacturers. Turns out nobody knew about it. The only one who knew about it said, oh, yeah, it's a very small operation. It just doesn't compare, but it's newsworthy, but it's not a reality. Mexico has made a decision to side with the U.S. on this, and China will not distract us.
Very helpful. Michael?
Totally 100% agree.
Right. To end on 100% agreement is always really nice. Look, we could go on for another hour. I've learned a tremendous amount from both of you today and over the years as I've read your work and heard you both speak. And so on behalf of the National Committee, thank you both for joining us. Thank all of you who listened in. And mostly also thank you to the National Committee staff behind the scenes who helped make all of this possible and get us all together. And if you enjoyed it, we hope you'll return for future National Committee programs that you can view on a variety of platforms. So thank you so much to both of you for doing this.